Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Daytona USA, an arcade racing game developed by Sega and released to arcades back in 1994, with a number of home ports following, including being a launch title for the Sega Saturn in North America. We are going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is customary, a little bit of housekeeping. This is episode number 20, the big 2-0, and I remain excited as ever. I hope you are all as well. I would love to hear from anybody who might be so inclined to provide feedback, suggestions, comments about the show, any future episodes or games you would like us to focus on. I'd love to hear from you, and there are a couple ways you can do that. I do have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. I also have a Twitter account with the handle @classicgamingt. So if anybody feels so inclined to reach out, talk about classic gaming, classic technology, gaming in general, the podcast, or pretty much anything else that may be on your mind, I would love to hear from you. For anybody who may be new, welcome. I just want to take a brief moment and talk about the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about history, the history of the game in question, the historical context of the game, where it sits within the historical context of the video and computer gaming industry. And once we do that, or after we do that, we go into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a rating or a ranking or a numerical value to individual games, but we do talk about every game from several different perspectives. We always look at the graphics. How does the game look? Sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and the overall feel. What does the game feel like to play today versus when it was released 20, 30, however many years ago? And we do all of that in order to determine and reach a verdict. If a game is that darn good, and it holds up today, it is a true classic, it becomes a member of the pantheon of classic gaming. That means you should play this game. Highly, highly recommended. It has not aged at all. It is just as good as it ever has been. Just below the pantheon are our golden oldies. These are games that are still darn good experiences, especially if you have nostalgia for the game or the genre in which it exists. You are almost guaranteed to have a good time. Definitely still highly recommended from my perspective. However, may have aged a little bit, just not quite at that pantheon level. Still great games, still highly recommend that you experience them. Beyond the golden oldies, we get to our mediocre mentions. These are the games that start getting into that territory where I can't really recommend the general population to play the game. Certainly if you have nostalgia for the title or you really like the genre in which it exists, go for it. You'll probably, or you may, have a good time. I guess it's kind of the verdict's out, 50-50. Maybe so, maybe not. But these are games that for the general population, I cannot recommend. They have either aged a bit less gracefully than some of the other titles, or they may have had a couple of issues early on to begin with that just continue to rear their ugly head today. And then beyond those, we get to our footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anybody to play these games. They are really not great experiences. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Daytona USA.
Roaring Star! Roaring Star!
Daytona USA was an arcade racing game developed by Sega and released to the arcades back in 1994. The golden age, well, maybe not the golden age, but definitely, I guess maybe a second golden age of arcades, because arcades kind of went through an 80s golden age, and then in the earlier 90s, there was definitely a A lot of focus in the arcades. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. Regardless of that, before we can actually start talking about Daytona USA itself, we have to talk about Sega's long history of arcade racing game development in particular. And to do that, we have to talk about a couple of incredibly influential Sega game designers, those being Yu Suzuki and Toshihiro Nagoshi. Now, Yu Suzuki joined Sega back in 1983 as a programmer. His first game, right out of the gate, after joining Sega, was a 2D boxing title called Championship Boxing for the Sega SG-1000, which was Sega's very first home console. Now, that game, even though it was his first, was so impressive that Sega released the game in arcades as is by simply putting an SG-1000 in an arcade cabinet and playing the game exactly as it was released in the home. That to me is just crazy. Arcades were vastly more powerful than home consoles at the time. The fact that this game was so good that all Sega did was take their console, plop it in an arcade cabinet, hook up a big TV, and let people just play the game as it existed at home, that is absolutely bonkers to me. The fact that that happened and that it was Suzuki's first year with the company was mind-blowing. In fact, Suzuki's early success was so profound that he was promoted to a project lead before he even reached his first anniversary with the company. And with that newfound responsibility, Suzuki had to figure out what he wanted to focus on for his next game. At the time, he was very interested in racing, and in particular was an avid motorcyclist. He decided to combine those two passions, as a lot of times people do, when they're thinking about what creative endeavor to do next, and he combined those passions into a singular vision as he began to work on his next title, Hang On, which was released in arcades in 1985. Hang On was an incredibly influential game for a number of reasons. First of all, Suzuki's design vision. He always wanted to create games using three-dimensional technology. He wasn't content with just the two-dimensional standard of the time. There was just one problem with that vision, though. 3D technology back in the 80s didn't really exist, but he didn't let that deter him. He decided that he would still design the game in 3D, but then he would convert it into 2D, and using specialized sprite scaling and rotation hardware, which was called the Sega Superscaler, he would create the illusion of a 3D experience. That Superscaler, by the way, Suzuki helped design that hardware, meaning he didn't have the hardware for his vision to be enabled, so he just went out and created it, or at a minimum, he contributed to its creation. I do want to spend just a moment talking about sprite scaling and perspectives, because we've talked about this a few times, but I think it bears mentioning specifically around some of these arcade experiences. So Outrun was a game that was a behind-the-rider experience. You would ride forward into the screen, so to speak. It really felt like you were riding head-on, albeit while seeing your character. And the way that this was done, this was not a three-dimensional world. It wasn't like there was a true three-dimensional open world where you were riding your motorcycle around. But because the Sega hardware that was created, this Superscaler, was able to scale sprites to different sizes based on the perspective of your character, how far away those sprites were from your character, how close they were to your character, it could create the illusion of depth. And that is how Yu Suzuki was able to translate a three-dimensional vision into the two-dimensional plane by basically tricking you. It's almost like an optical illusion via clever programming tricks to make it seem as though you were actually experiencing a three-dimensional perspective, when in reality, everything in the game was purely two-dimensional. Now, if that was the only innovation for Outrun, I think it would be a pretty darn innovative title, but it was not the only innovation. It was also the first arcade game to use 16-bit graphics, which meant it had a gigantic jump in visual fidelity in comparison to other games of the time. That wasn't even its most influential piece. Most influentially, Hang On was the first arcade game that incorporated full-body motion controls. So, let's talk about that for a second. Arcades at the time had a number of different control schemes, and if you walked up to an arcade cabinet, I could guarantee you that you could experience any number of potential control schemes for any number of cabinets that you would walk up to. Some would have just joysticks. Others would have a joystick and a button. Some might have a joystick and 3 buttons. It's all sorts of stuff. Some would have a trackball. Some would have a spinner. All sorts of control schemes existed in the arcades. But Suzuki didn't want to rely on any of those pre-existing controls. He wanted to create something more realistic. So he created technology that allowed the player to control their racer by riding on top of a motorcycle in the arcade, with steering accomplished by shifting the player's weight left or right while holding onto a motorcycle handlebar, while hydraulic systems made it so the experience was smooth and remained upright. Basically, it was a direct, albeit arcade, recreation of the act of riding a motorcycle. This was revolutionary, literally a brand new technology and approach that didn't exist before. And as you might imagine, it led to Hang On being a universal success and spawning the entire genre of full cabinet motion simulator body-controlled arcade experiences. With Suzuki firmly establishing himself as one of the most innovative designers in game development, he turned his attention to other kinds of games with similar kinds of immersive experiences. We're not going to touch on every single one of Suzuki's innovations because they are vast, but I do want to talk about Outrun, which was one of the next racing games that he worked on. Released to the arcades in 1986, Outrun continued Suzuki's trend of innovating and creating amazing, well-received arcade experiences. Rather than being a motorcycle racing title this time, Outrun was a car-based racing title where the player would drive a Ferrari to one of several destinations, with each one representing a different difficulty. Similar in style to Hang On, you played the game from a behind-the-car perspective, and while there were multiple versions of the game released, the most impressive was a full motion simulator arcade cabinet modeled after the car in the game. You'd sit down and, depending on your actions on the screen, the cabinet would move, shake, and otherwise create the sensation that you were actually controlling a real supercar. There were a number of innovations introduced in this game as well, beyond the motion simulator cabinet design. For example, Outrun introduced simulation-driven car performance, where things like horsepower, torque, and tire gripping were built into the game engine. Also included the ability to drift. It wasn't a full-featured physics-driven drifting model. And let's just talk about drift real quick, just in case anybody has not watched Fast and the Furious. So drifting is where you turn into a curve and you apply the brakes so that rather than just turning the car or curving the car around the corner, you effectively slide or skid around. And there is some real science behind this and actual real automotive technology here. I am not an automotive guy, so you're going to have to deal with my layman kind of explanation. But basically, it's almost like sliding around a curve rather than turning your car around a curve. And then as you come out of the curve, you accelerate and straighten out the car, and then you're able to go off faster. So that's a way of racing without losing as much speed when you go around corners or curves or things like that. So that was included in Outrun. It wasn't a full physical simulation, but it was still an option. It was still something you could do in the arcade game. Additionally, Outrun introduced the ability to choose different songs to listen to via an in-game radio selection. That was also the first of its kind, and as many might imagine or at least recognize, that's kind of used everywhere now. And ever since then, you've pretty much had the ability to listen to radios in both racing games as well as open world games and all other kinds of games that have followed. Think Grand Theft Auto, where what would that experience be like without the radio there? Would it have a radio if Outrun didn't do it first? Well, maybe, because it's still a car simulation, but maybe not. Who knows? Regardless, Outrun was incredibly innovative when it was released back in the arcade. In fact, it was so advanced, and the quality and speed of the graphics was so intense that Suzuki once again had to work with the hardware team to create a brand new arcade board just for this game. Also similar to his prior games, Outrun was a huge success, becoming Japan's highest-grossing arcade game of 1987. Suzuki would continue to work on innovative arcade technology, spearheading the development of multiple arcade hardware platforms and continuing to rise in Sega's ranks. If we fast forward to 1989, Suzuki is leading a large team of developers, designers, and other industry creatives. Sega itself was starting to restructure its arcade division, standing up a number of amusement machine research and development teams whose purpose was to innovate and release technologically advanced arcade games. Suzuki was made the general manager of the R&D 2 team, otherwise known as Sega AM2. It was also around this time that he hired a new designer onto the team, a man by the name of Toshihiro Nagoshi. Nagoshi graduated from college with a degree in movie production, and his first assignment under the newly formed AM2 division of Sega was to act as the designer for yet another new, innovative arcade racing experience. That would be Virtua Racing. The underlying hardware behind Virtua Racing was the result of Sega trying to figure out how to remain competitive in the arcade industry while staying far ahead of home console technology. Remember, arcades around now were always considered the premier place to experience the hottest games, with home console ports often being inferior versions. Upon the release of the Sega Genesis, which was itself a huge technological leap over the Sega Master System and other 8-bit home consoles, Sega began strategizing about how to improve the quality of their arcade titles even further so that they could remain profitable. The thought being that if consumers could get the same experience at home, there'd be no reason to spend their quarters in arcades. So, Sega decided that they would turn their arcade game attention to full 3D polygon-driven engines. And to do that, they began creating new arcade hardware yet again, which would eventually come into being as the Sega Model 1 arcade system. Virtua Racing would become the first game developed for that system. With Suzuki directing the development of the game, he and Nagoshi set out to begin designing a new, innovative arcade racing experience. Similar to other Yu Suzuki arcade racing games, the player would sit in a motion simulator modeled like a Formula One race car cockpit and have the ability to steer their car around tracks, feeling every rumble and swerve of the road as they raced against other players and CPU-controlled drivers. I do want to mention a quick note about race formats. When we talk about racing, and more specifically the sport of automobile racing, there are a bunch of different variations. Things like Formula One, Formula E, Rally Car, Indy Car, and the list goes on. That's most of the ones I know. Regardless, the list keeps going on, and the most popular format in Japan at the time of Virtua Racing's release was Formula One. And that format is where drivers sit in an open-air vehicle, so there's no roof, with large wheels and race around tracks with tons of curves and turns. Virtua Racing would be Sega's implementation of Formula One racing for arcades. As mentioned, Virtua Racing would be the first game created for the Sega Model 1 arcade system, and unlike prior arcade racing games that Suzuki created, would feature a true 3D polygon-based world with every single object created with 3D technology. So this was a major leap over his two-dimensional games that simply recreated or tricked players into thinking they were seeing a 3D perspective. This was true 3D. And I do want to have a quick word about the visuals in the game. Yes, it was a 3D world. Yes, there were polygons. This was not, at least from today's perspective, advanced 3D accelerated technology. Everything you see in the game in Virtua Racing were flat shaded polygons. There were no textures. Each polygon would effectively be a different color with various shades used to create a feeling of depth. It was certainly primitive by today's standards, but with the power of the arcade hardware, thousands of polygons could be processed on every single frame, so it maintained a smooth, fast pace that made the game feel really good to play. It wasn't the first true 3D polygonal arcade racing game, but it would be the most advanced graphically, as it could process nearly 3 times the number of polygons as competitor systems. With the move to 3D, Nagoshi's film production education came into play, so he was able to use his knowledge of framing scenes in a 3D space to better design the player's interactions with the 3D world. With the move to a 3D world, the game also was able to include multiple player perspectives. Rather than just a behind-the-car view of the action, players could now choose from one of 4 different viewpoints and swap between them during play. Beyond the traditional behind-the-car view, players could also choose a first-person perspective, even further creating the sensation that you were a driver on these tracks. The system was so influential that all Sega arcade racing games released after Virtua Racing would adopt the same viewpoint system. The entire experience would prove to be incredibly popular with arcade goers, as it would quickly become one of the highest grossing arcade games in the world in 1992 and 1993. And with the success of this new arcade hardware, attention turned to Sega AM2's next project. Given the growth of the division and the success they had experienced thus far, it was decided that AM2 would work on not one, but two different titles at the same time. Yu Suzuki turned his attention to one of the games, which would eventually morph into Virtua Fighter, while Toshiro Nagoshi, Suzuki's hire who designed Virtua Racing, would be assigned the task of directing the other title. Virtua Fighter would be developed using the existing Sega Model 1 arcade system, but the team knew they wanted to drive even greater technological advancement into their arcade systems, so they decided that the title being developed under Nagoshi would utilize newer technology, which would result in the creation of the Sega Model 2 arcade system. This was a natural evolution of the Model 1 system, where that board could process 180,000 flat-shaded polygons per second. This new system would be able to process 300,000 fully texture-mapped polygons per second, which was an astronomical improvement in such a short period of time. You might ask, how could the gaming industry improve so quickly in such a short period of time? Well, partnering with the defense industry was the answer, as Sega began working with GE Aerospace and Lockheed Martin to utilize military-level processing systems for their arcade systems. Lockheed Martin in particular had developed a highly advanced technology for texture mapping polygons for the military, and Sega wanted to use it in their hardware. The only problem was, as with many bleeding-edge military technologies, the cost for the technology was in the millions of dollars. Sega turned to Yu Suzuki, who somehow managed to engineer that technology down into a single chipset that would cost $50 to produce, allowing them to build the tech into their Model 2 system. Seriously, Yu Suzuki is both a creative and technological genius. Absolutely insane levels of genius from an engineering perspective. A lot of respect for him. So, getting back to the story. Sega had decided on the technology upon which Nagoshi's game would be built. The question was, what would the game actually be? As various ideas were being brainstormed, Tom Pettit, who was the president of Sega America's arcade division, suggested that their next game might be another racing title, but this time focused on NASCAR, which was an American stock car racing association. So, Formula One, which we talked about a little bit ago, that was still the more popular racing organization outside of the United States, but NASCAR presented a unique opportunity, and one that Pettit believed would really appeal to the American market, if not the world at large. Sega Europe's executives, as you might imagine, had some concerns, but despite those reservations, the broader leadership team approved the concept. The racing game would be an arcade simulation of NASCAR stock car racing. As Nagoshi and the team was brainstorming the idea and the design of the game, they had one overarching goal. As directed to them by Sega leadership, this new game needed to beat the competition, which in this case was primarily a racing game released by Namco in 1993 called Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer itself was a technological marvel at the time, as it was the first arcade video game to include texture map polygons, so no more flat shading, this was all texture map polygons within the game. It provided players with the ability to drive mountainous roads and drift around curves and corners, all while maintaining an incredible sense of speed and high levels of graphical fidelity. Its only drawback was the fact that it was a single-player only experience. You could only race against computer-controlled cars, not other people. Regardless of that, it would become one of the highest-grossing arcade titles of the year. With that competitive environment in mind, Nagoshi and the team turned their attention to beating their arcade racing rival and figuring out how to distinguish their new title from the competition. Early on, there were actually plans to acquire a license from NASCAR to use their tracks, cars, and sponsors, which the team thought would give it an advantage in comparison to Ridge Racer's purely fictional environments and cars. But it was determined that the license would be too expensive, so the team decided to create a more fictional stock car racing experience. Nagoshi, as the director of the game, had no experience with NASCAR at all, so he was given the opportunity to attend a NASCAR event in the United States to help better understand the general concept and culture. He'd further go on to read numerous books and watch videos on NASCAR, all in the hopes of gaining better knowledge about the sport to convey that knowledge to the rest of his team, which was met with limited success. Though I did find it interesting that one of the planners on the game, a man named Makoto Osaki, ended up purchasing a sports car and watching the NASCAR-themed Tom Cruise movie Days of Thunder more than 100 times by his own admission. So I guess it worked on at least somebody on Nagoshi's staff. So as Nagoshi was immersing himself in NASCAR culture, he needed to figure out how to convert that knowledge into a game, with one of the most critical tasks of any racing game being what the tracks were going to look like. The team began by trying to model existing NASCAR tracks, such as the Daytona International Speedway, by using a combination of satellite imagery and photographs taken by the team. Nagoshi himself even walked a full lap, which is 2.5 miles, to get a better feel for how banking would work around the corners. Despite those efforts, it was determined that rather than modeling their tracks on existing real-world locations, they'd create their own tracks based loosely on the concepts they observed at the real-world locations. That decision was really based on two factors. One, they thought that basing the tracks on only locations and designs from United States courses would possibly alienate players in Europe and Japan, and secondly, they thought the general design of most NASCAR tracks was pretty boring. And for those who may not know, almost all NASCAR tracks are effectively ovals. Just go around in a big oval couple hundred times, if not more. I don't really watch NASCAR, but I can appreciate what they're doing. But the thought amongst the team was that just oval tracks, that's probably not going to be super exciting for an arcade racing experience. Though eventually, Nagoshi settled on 3 tracks, each representing a different difficulty level. The first track, which was called 3-7 Speedway, is effectively the closest you'd come to seeing a NASCAR course in the game, with the second and third tracks being more open road-centric kinds of courses. Despite having fictional courses, though, the team was still looking to mimic the general feel of stock car racing. But eventually, Nagoshi decided to steer away from realism and simulation to instead improve the fun of the experience. This is actually how drifting came to be added to the game, as NASCAR stock cars don't drift. In the game, though, they would. And interestingly, one of Ridge Racer's primary driving mechanics centered on drifting. That was just one example of how the team was trying to make sure their game was on par with the competition. When it came to the game's graphics, the team was able to leverage the power of the Sega Model 2 board to process fully texture-mapped polygons with higher speeds than what the Sega Model 1 board could do, even without texture mapping. This allowed the game to look more realistic than any Sega racing game that had come before it. With a 3D world that evolved from Virtua Racing, the team similarly took some other innovations from that title to apply to the new game, such as the multiple viewpoint system that players could swap between during the race, and the overall ability to navigate and race in a true 3-dimensional space. Basically, everything they learned from Virtua Racing they evolved, and then applied those evolutionary things to the new game. The responsibility for music would fall to a man named Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, who didn't have any major game credits at the time. He didn't have any knowledge of stock car racing. So basically all he did was think to himself, what would be a good arcade-style set of songs that would go well with a racing game? Ridge Racer had used a techno soundtrack, and Mitsuyoshi knew he wanted to do something different from that, but he still wasn't sure what. Ultimately, he ended up using samples and his own voice recordings to compose the soundtrack for the game, as that meant he'd be able to complete his work quicker. Eventually, all of the pieces came into place, and Daytona USA was released to arcades in 1994, at which point it became a nearly instant sensation, both among players as well as critics, who lauded it as something people had never seen before, with many wondering how it was even possible to achieve these special effects in a game. Gamers would form lines to play the game, and I personally remember queuing up to play 8-player linked mode at my local Dave & Buster's and other arcade venues. It was so popular that you couldn't get a seat for the game. You literally had to wait, even with a ton of linked machines available to play. Unlike Ridge Racer, and this is something that was key to Daytona USA's success, it was always planned for multiplayer from the start, which was very similar to other Sega arcade racers. This absolutely played a role in its popularity, which, by the way, was nearly unrivaled. It spent 16 months as the #1 arcade game in the world, with over 5 years in total spent on the list of most played arcade games. Its fame and popularity outlasted nearly every other arcade racing game ever released up to that point. According to Sega sales figures, it became one of the most successful arcade games of all time. Daytona USA would spawn a series of arcade sequels as well as a number of home ports, each of which, as usual, had their own little quirks. The game was released as a launch title for the Sega Saturn, which included additional cars than the arcade version, but several compromises had to be made for the game to run well on that particular system, primarily in terms of graphics and frame rate, which ran at a third of the speed of the arcade version. Interestingly, while Daytona USA conquered the arcade market and beat its nearest competition, Ridge Racer, in the home, the Ridge Racer PlayStation 1 port was heralded as a better experience than the Saturn version of Daytona USA. Other ports included releases for Windows, which was very similar to the Saturn release, the Sega Dreamcast, which was much higher quality than the Saturn version, and eventually more modern console releases on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. These newer releases in particular were touted as arcade-perfect ports, at least as far as visuals and audio is concerned. Regardless of these home ports, if you were frequenting arcades in the mid-90s, I can almost guarantee that you played at least a few rounds of Daytona USA. Its combination of visuals, smooth driving, friendly competition, and pure arcade fun created an experience that was almost unlike anything people had experienced to that point. Its place on many individuals' best games of all time list is certainly well understood, and the only unfortunate thing with Daytona USA is that it can't really be found in modern arcades of today. It's one of those titles that deserves a place in any arcade, even almost 30 years after its release. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, Daytona USA is a game that set a new standard for arcade racing, and its place in history will likely remain untouched for many years to come. We are now going to transition to talk about how Daytona USA feels to play today versus when it was released. So just as a reminder, Daytona USA was released in 1994 in the arcades. It is an arcade racing game experience. So arcade racing game, what exactly does that mean? Well, it basically means these are not a realistic kind of driving experience. This is not a realistic driving experience in that you will likely be able to go faster than what you would normally be able to go in a real car. You'll likely crash but not die. You'll be able to just kind of have fun with it. Arcade racers are pretty much all about having fun. It's not about the realism of games like Gran Turismo or similar kinds of titles, or Forza I can't even speak. Forza Motorsport. It's not like that. It's not about the realism. It's really more about the fun. So yes, all of these games are built on a degree of real physics and real physics engines, but they really take a little bit of liberty with the overall realism of the driving, realism of the game. They don't want you to have to learn how to drive real race cars. They want you to just have fun and experience the sensation of speed, which will just knock your socks off. So how do they do that? Well, they create the game using a combination of motion simulation. So you're in a cabinet. Most of the time you're in a cabinet and it's shaped or at least styled like a car. You will feel the rumble of the steering wheel. The steering wheel will jerk left and right. It might have force feedback in there that makes it feel like you're really racing, albeit you're not really, obviously. There are pedals, there's gear shifts. It basically makes it feel like you're driving a real car, albeit a very forgiving car, because even though you're in a motion simulator, you are not driving a simulation. It is a representation of the act of driving a race car, but it is most certainly not real. A lot of times when you would drive around, and now let's talk specific about Daytona USA, you will crash a lot, or at least I crashed a lot. And actually, when you were playing multiplayer, and multiplayer was a big thing here. We're going to talk multiplayer in a minute, but when you would play multiplayer with Daytona USA, actually crashing your car into your opponents was a strategy. I don't know if it was the best strategy, but it was certainly one of my strategies. I know that especially on the first track, that 3.7 Speedway, when you would come around the final curve right near the end of a lap, there was a spot where everybody would kind of get bunched up, and you could definitely ram those other opponents into the side and make them crash, and you would be able to gain a few positions if you do it the right way. Once again, not a simulation, purely a fun experience, but boy, was it fun. So crashes, well modeled in the game, didn't really affect your overall performance, at least in the arcade. In the home versions, they did have certain options that would allow you to mimic to a degree how car damage would affect you, and then you could go to the pit stop and get repaired and all that kind of stuff. But in the arcade, it was all about just keep driving effectively. If you were trying to be a little bit less homicidal, you would be able to maneuver around cars rather than crash them into walls. So rather than trying to wreck your opponents, you could actually race the way racing was intended to be. But where's the fun in that? So talking about multiplayer, I do want to talk about multiplayer because this was the reason, from my perspective, that Daytona USA was so popular in the arcades when it came out. Picture this. You are waiting. You're in your arcade. You're in an arcade. You're waiting your turn for Daytona USA. Finally, your number comes up, and you enter one of 8 cars, and you are at the start line. You are immersed in the experience. The sound is so loud. There's gigantic speakers. There's videos on the wall. There's television monitors on the wall. You could see every single racer. Sometimes they even have cameras focused on your face that would project your face up on the screen. And then the race starts and everybody is out for blood. They are all trying to win. It is a highly competitive thing. And no matter what place you come in, it was just fun. That is one of the things that I miss about arcades in general, is the multiplayer aspect, the in-person, competitive, fun kind of environment. Because yes, you have multiplayer online. It's not the same. It is not the same as sitting shoulder to shoulder with somebody and playing a game. Apologies for the minor tangent. Daytona USA had amazing multiplayer in the arcade. Now, they only had 3 tracks in the game, and you might think, especially if you're thinking about modern racing titles or modern car titles on current systems, 3 tracks, it's not really that much. But you know what? In an arcade experience, it absolutely works. So let's talk about each of those 3 tracks. You had the very first track, which was the 3-7 Speedway. This was as close as you were going to get to an oval NASCAR kind of course. Very simple, literally just effectively going around in a circle, but it was fun. It was a good way to get indoctrinated into the game. And for me, anytime I would race in the arcade, this would be the track that I would want to play because I wanted to experience as much of the multiplayer competitiveness as possible. I didn't want the track to be as big of a determining factor on the play, on me actually being able to succeed or fail. I would rather it be the strategy of working around the other multiplayer opponents that I was facing. Daytona USA really shines in that aspect with multiplayer. Computer control, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but multiplayer is where it's at. The second track was known as Dinosaur Canyon, and that, as the name suggests, was positioned primarily in a canyon that you would have to navigate and had some additional features. By the way, the arcade version of the game didn't really have names for each of these tracks. The home version started to name them, but in the arcade, they were simply beginner, advanced, and expert. So the advanced track was this Dinosaur Canyon, which was much less NASCAR-centric. It was really more about navigating a bunch of curves and some hairpin turns to try to beat your competition. And then the expert track, the third track, was Seaside Street Galaxy, which, well, that was a tough one. They had, this was basically riding through kind of a city bridge kind of atmosphere and lots of turns, lots of curves, lots of needing to drift around the curves in order to be successful. And we'll talk about the drift mechanics in Daytona USA very soon. But those were the 3 tracks. I always preferred the beginner track, not because I didn't fancy myself a driver, but more so because the other tracks just got really hard. And I cared more about the multiplayer than I did about the difficulty of the track, personally. As part of the simulation aspect of the game, you can choose between manual and automatic transmission for your cars. Manual transmission being the kind of cars where you would control with a stick shift, and automatic being ones that automatically change gears as you accelerate. The manual transmission cars do have a higher top speed, but generally speaking, they are more difficult to play. So there's kind of a risk-reward system going on there. So let's talk about drifting in Daytona USA. So drifting, like we talked about, and once again, layman definition, is kind of sliding around a corner or sliding around a curve with your car to try to minimize the loss of speed as you're navigating any sort of turn. Drifting in Daytona USA, you would not think would be a necessary aspect of the game to win. And I am here to tell you that would be a wrong thought. You must drift in order to win. So let's talk about the act of playing the game. We'll get into the review stuff, the more specific sections in a minute, but I want to talk about the act of playing the game. First of all, full disclosure, I do not have a Daytona USA arcade cabinet at home. I don't have a Daytona USA steering wheel. I don't have a Daytona USA motion simulator. None of that. So in order to best replicate the arcade experience, I ended up playing the Xbox 360 version because that was the one most readily available, and everything I had read suggested that it was truly arcade perfect as far as the graphics and the visuals. So I figured, yes, the control scheme is going to be a little off because it's not using a steering wheel, you're not using pedals, but it can at least simulate to the best degree possible what that arcade experience was going to be like. I mentioned in the arcades, I primarily played Daytona USA for multiplayer. I did not play for computer racing because, I mean, it's fun enough, but the real fun is in human-controlled opponents. Unfortunately, the Xbox 360 version, because it is pretty darn old at this point, did not have anybody available for online play. So I was forced to play all of Daytona USA for the purpose of this podcast as a solo venture just against the computer. And let me tell you something about arcade level computer artificial intelligence. It is hard. We talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about Final Fight as just an example of how the arcade games were just more difficult than their home counterparts, because the whole purpose of an arcade is to get people to keep putting quarters in the machine and to keep making money for the arcade operators. There is no incentive to make the games easy or forgiving or anything. It's really all about how do I get as much money from the player as possible and minimize their time on the machine, or at least their time in a given play, so that they'll spend more money to continue to play. Daytona USA, the artificial intelligence for the racers, they are pretty tough. It took me a while. It took me a while to actually get good enough to be able to beat the computer-controlled cars on the Xbox 360 version, which once again, considering it is supposedly an arcade-perfect port, should represent the rough experience that you would have had in an arcade. I have fond recollections of my arcade Daytona USA racing. Like I said, most of that was against multiplayer. I can't really speak about the computer-controlled opponents, but for the purposes of this discussion, I can, and boy, were they hard. And I mention that just to say, if you don't drift, if you take corners and curves the way a normal person would in a NASCAR car, there is no way you're going to win. You have to pull out all the stops. You have to drift in order to do that. Even though NASCAR cars don't drift in real life, you have to drift or you will not win. And drifting as a mechanic is something that takes a little bit of getting used to. Spoiler alert on the Xbox 360 controls, they're very sensitive. Much more sensitive than what you would have controlling the game with a wheel. So just playing the game itself takes some getting used to. Then learning how to drift takes some getting used to. And then getting good enough to be able to avoid cars, not crash, and actually win each of your races takes a little bit of time to do. So that was my experience, at least playing the game up front here for the Xbox 360 versus my recollections from the arcade. So take that as what it is. We're going to start talking about the more specific elements of the game, but first, I do want to look at what the back of the box says. Now, Daytona USA, obviously an arcade title, didn't have a box when it was first released because it was released in an arcade cabinet, but it did eventually have some home ports, and those ports did certainly have a box, and I'm always interested in understanding and seeing how marketing departments and development teams market their titles. So for Daytona USA, I decided to look at the back of the Dreamcast jewel case because from my standpoint, up until the Xbox 360 version, the Dreamcast version was the version to beat. So for Daytona USA, the Dreamcast jewel case back of the box says, "Start your engines. Daytona USA delivers the blistering speed and bumper crashing action of stock car racing and takes it online. Download driving records and develop your racing strategy against a ghost car, then compete in network rankings. With exclusive new racing circuits and secret unlockable vehicles, Daytona USA provides an incredible racing experience every time you put the pedal to the metal. Compete online with up to 3 other players or go head-to-head in split-screen action. 8 racing circuits, including 5 popular circuits from past Daytona games and 3 exclusive new circuits for Dreamcast. View performance rankings or download competitive driving records and ghost cars to practice against, and experience the heated thrills of white-knuckle racing with up to 40 cars on the track." So a couple things to mention here that were different from the arcade. Actually, the home versions of the game did try to evolve on the arcade, understanding that the arcades are really built for kind of get in, get out kind of gameplay. They only had 3 tracks, didn't really have much from a car selection perspective. It was all just automatic versus manual. When the game came home, they did add additional features to the game to make it more of a friendly home experience. So adding additional tracks, adding additional cars, additional features around time trials and stuff like that. That was necessary because taking an arcade game and just plopping it right down at home without adding those extras, doesn't always work that well. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it works okay. But for a racing game, that'd be a hard sell to buy at home. Just 3 tracks, just not really any sort of car selection other than the type of transmission that you have. That'd be a tough sell for 50 or 60 bucks. So I can understand why they added that. So anyway, that was the Daytona USA back of the jewel case for the Dreamcast version. We're going to move on now to talk more specifically about the individual elements of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. And I've got to say, the graphics still hold up just fine today. The texture mapped polygons, the speed of the game, it all feels great to look at. I will admit, they don't have the realism of Forza Horizon or modern Gran Turismo titles, but it doesn't need to. This is an arcade racer. It doesn't have to be super realistic. The gameplay is what's important, and the visuals are good enough that you're not going to really have any complaints. The gameplay is silky smooth. It is like a smooth 60 frames per second. It never drops. The animations feel great. The visuals look sharp. It's really pleasing to look at. And when you combine the sense of speed with the overall graphical fidelity of the game, especially compared to other arcade racers out around that time, Daytona USA pretty much blows them all out of the water. Even looking at it from today's perspective and the graphics that we are all spoiled with, Daytona USA still looks good. Yes, you could tell it's older. Yes, you can tell it's from an era of gaming that is most decidedly in the past. But it still looks good to me. I have no issue with how the graphics look. Certainly, I have a bit of nostalgia because I've played it before, but even independent of that nostalgia, the graphics still hold up today. Moving on to the sound and music, I just have one word to say to you. Daytona! Who doesn't know the Daytona USA theme? How can you not know that? It is like the 90s arcade in a nutshell is that one word. The theme song is about as memorable as any song I have ever heard in an arcade. I remember that blaring over the speakers in arcades and just running to the machines to get on there. That song and the other songs in the game, they're all similarly styled. They are iconic. If you were in the arcade in the 90s, you know it. You know the theme song. You know the songs from Daytona. You could pick it out even blindfolded. And the beginning of the first track with Rolling Start is just amazing too. Like, I'm sorry about the singing, but this is one of those games and one of those soundtracks that just gets me excited. There's not a ton of music in the game, but it is so perfect with the racing action. I cannot stress enough how perfect this music matches the game. And the fact that the composer, he didn't really have much in the way of credits before this, and he used his own voice tracks in order to record the game. I just have no words. These are iconic auditory experiences, and Anybody who experienced them in the arcade knows exactly what I'm talking about. Even if you haven't, it still sounds great today. They're not, now, in all fairness, they are not the most complex audio arrangements, but it fits the game perfectly. As for the sound effects beyond the music, the revving of the engines, the squeal of the wheels, the hard-hitting crunches as cars crash into each other, all of those sound effects sound great. Moving on to the narrative and story, there is none. So moving on to playability and controls, if you play this in the arcade, it will feel pitch perfect. The driving controls are amazing. Even people with little actual driving experience were able to pick this up and play. I can talk from my own experience. I was a kid when this came out. I was around 13 or so when this came out in the arcades. I had never driven a car before. I was able to drive Daytona USA, and it felt amazing. And I'd said before, multiplayer Daytona USA is one of the most fun arcade experiences I ever had in my entire life. The unfortunate thing is that arcade Daytona USA, I don't know where it exists. I mean, you could technically set up your own cabinet with your own motion simulator and wheels and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of expensive to do. And I have no idea where there's an arcade, a modern arcade with Daytona USA there, even a retro arcade. I don't know where you can find Daytona USA today, at least not the way it had been with a bunch of linked cabinets and things like that. So I will say the arcade experience, I wasn't able to play it exactly, but I can tell you just based on my recollection, it will hold up. It will still feel awesome. Xbox 360, which is the closest we're going to get to an arcade perfect port, controls are okay. Definitely a little bit twitchy. Something you can get used to, but it does require a little bit of dedication in order to actually feel like you're controlling the cars okay. Also, we talked about the drifting. Drifting is key in this game. That takes itself a little bit of getting used to as well. Overall, the controls are fine for the home versions. I mean, it's kind of not as good as modern racing titles by far that control really nicely with the analog sticks and have a lot of different kind of simulation-esque mechanics built into the game. And like the drifting in Forza Horizon, as an example, is the way you should do drifting in racing games. I love the Forza Horizon series, so I have had a lot of fun with that one. Daytona USA does not feel nearly as good as Forza, at least from an Xbox perspective. But it's still okay on the Xbox 360. It's just, it cannot capture the arcade magic. There is no way to capture the arcade magic short of being in an arcade or spending a ton of money on your own motion simulator, car, wheels, pedals, stick shift. It's just a lot of investment in order to recreate Daytona USA in the home. So for what we got, Xbox 360, it's passable. It is not nearly as good as the arcade. Overall, though, how does it feel to play? It still feels great. Even playing on a controller, while it does take some getting used to, and it is something that I would say is not the best experience, it's still fine. You just have to put in some time getting used to the overall controls and how sensitive some of the steering is and how you navigate the tracks. The one thing I do want to say about the computer-controlled cars, and something I found a little bit, I guess interesting is the right word, maybe a little disappointing. The way that the CPU AI works is it almost seems like there are a very finite set of predetermined actions by the CPU controlled cars. And what you'll be able to do is if you play the Xbox 360 version and you pay close attention to the beginning of your race, if you're able to start out the race with the speed boost, and I can't remember what it's called, it's some sort of like rocket boost or rocket launch or something like that, where basically if you hold the brake and accelerate up to a certain amount of RPMs, then you release the brake and you accelerate, it gives you a bit of a boost at the beginning of the race. If you do that, you will see that every single car in the CPU controlled environment behaves exactly the same way every single time. So they make the same exact movements, they make the same exact shifts, they make the same exact lane changes every single time. If you start out without that boost and you just hold the accelerator down, the cars will behave differently, but they'll behave in that same way every time you start the race with that given action. So it's kind of an odd AI thing. It's not true AI, and granted, this was an older game and mostly designed for multiplayer, so I get it. But it's just one of those things I noticed. Now, this is one of those things I cannot confirm with the arcade version, whether this was something that was in the arcade version or not. I cannot confirm it one way or the other. I can tell you the Xbox 360 version definitely has some weird AI kinds of things that just make the game feel not quite as dynamic as it could potentially have been. Putting that aside, when you do actually play the game, when you pass the cars, and you can even use a slipstream to slingshot past leaders, and weaving through traffic to improve your position, and just overall how you navigate the tracks, it all feels amazing even today, especially after you get used to the controls. Once you're used to the controls, you can really navigate those tracks really well. And once you get used to the drifting, you feel like Vin Diesel in Fast and the Furious. You really do. It's a pretty cool feeling. Now, we talked about this a little bit before, but I do want to mention it again because it does affect the overall feel. The difficulty of the game. On the Xbox 360 version, there was an arcade mode and there was a normal mode. You need to be, even on the normal mode, so arcade mode is the most difficulty in the game. Even in normal mode, which is normalized for home play and for controller inputs versus the steering wheel and pedals in the arcade, you still need to be pretty much almost perfect to win against the CPU. In arcade mode, I don't even think you can win unless you're using manual transmission. We talked about the fact that automatic versus manual transmission, the manual transmission cars have a higher top speed. I don't think you can win, and somebody prove me wrong. I don't think you can win arcade mode difficulty unless you're using manual transmission against the computer. I tried. I don't think it's possible. Maybe there's better drivers than I am that can do it, but it certainly seemed like manual transmission is a requirement to deal with that harder difficulty. You also have to drive every single track perfectly. If you crash once, I can guarantee you will not win that race. There is literally no room for error. So, overall, what do we think? Where does this sit? Is this a classic gaming pantheon entry? Well, I'm going to say this is a tricky one because the way that I've been basing all of my decisions for this podcast on is playing the game in its original version. It's the original way the game was designed and created. That's the experience I want to have. And unfortunately, I don't have an arcade with a full driving setup to play Daytona USA on. That said, the Xbox 360 version in every aspect other than the controls still holds up as well today as it did nearly 30 years ago. Controlling the cars with a controller isn't nearly as precise or fun as controlling the cars with a full driving setup. But it is still a bunch of fun. It is fun, it's just not as fun, and it's certainly not as precise. If you add in the true feel of driving the courses using appropriate arcade hardware, though, so if you put aside the controller and you say, imagine what it would be like on arcade hardware, or remember what it would be like on arcade hardware, and you couple that with the multiplayer, which, like I said, they do have on the Xbox, but nobody was playing when I was playing the game, so I couldn't really compare the multiplayer with the Xbox versus arcade version. So if you look at the arcade version with a steering wheel and with multiplayer, you have a game that will stand the test of time likely forever. It is that darn good. It is sheer fun. Its visuals are still high quality. The sound and the audio, the music is iconic. Because of all of that, especially in its original version as an arcade classic, this is an obvious selection for the pantheon of classic gaming. Now, I could see if somebody only played the Xbox version with controllers as the main control scheme, you might wonder what all the fuss is about, because it's basically a game with only 3 tracks and 2 car styles. It is not a Forza kind of experience. But the unfortunate thing is, there is little that can replicate the true arcade feeling. And in the world of arcade gaming, there is little that can replicate the feeling of a good Daytona USA competitive match. The few minutes that you're in that cockpit, you feel like a true racing legend. While that experience can't truly translate to the home, the fact remains that Daytona USA in its original arcade form belongs in the pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Daytona USA. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to let me know how I'm doing or give me some suggestions for future episodes, advice, feedback, critique, whatever it is, there are a couple of ways you can reach out to me. I do have a Twitter handle. It is @ClassicGamingT. I also have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. So feel free to drop me a line. I am definitely interested in hearing what you think. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that the next episode is focused on Heart of the Alien, which is the sequel to Out of This World, released only on the Sega CD in North America. So a little bit of a more eccentric pick, I'll say. I'm looking forward to talking about it. I hope you are all looking forward to listening to it. If you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of the game, feel free to write in. I'm definitely interested in hearing what you think. At the same time, I recognize that you're all listening to this podcast on any number of podcast aggregation engines or services, and if you feel so inclined, I would love if you'd leave us a review. It's not about bolstering star counts. It's not about getting a bunch of 5-star reviews, though certainly if that happens, that'd be great because that means we're doing something right. But I am legitimately interested in understanding what we need to do to make this the best possible podcast it can be. The only way to do that is to get feedback from the listener community and make sure we're delivering the content that you all want to hear. So please, if you feel so inclined, feel free to leave a review. I would certainly appreciate it. We are continuing to grow. We are continuing to develop the community. I'm excited about what the future holds. I hope you are all as well. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Heart of the Alien. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.